All right, folks, welcome back from break. We are now going to talk about the React component lifecycle methods. What on earth does that mean? So when we're extending the React base class from React.component, let's go and look at that real quick. In the React documentation, you're going to see, that's not the React documentation, this. So this React.component is a package that's given to us. So it's an object that's given to us as a base class that we can extend and use to our advantage. One of the advantages we get from this, you guys already know. What is the advantage that I'm talking about? I love the feedback, Matthias. I will do my best. Yeah, we get the class, but what do we get out of the extending the component? State, right? We get the ability to have our own component state. Okay. Now, one of the other advantages that we get out of the React component class is this idea of a life cycle. And you can think of a life cycle the same exact way you'd think of like a butterfly. Okay, starts out as a simple insect, a simple caterpillar, goes and creates a cocoon, so something happens and it changes its state, and then eventually it turns into a butterfly and it's no longer a caterpillar, and then eventually it dies. Okay, so life cycle in the sense of we have an application or a component that is alive on the screen as long as it is alive on the screen. In fact, I'm going to actually use the to-do app to demonstrate this for a second. Okay, we're gonna extend the capabilities of that to-do app. All right, so notice that I have just a single hard-coded example of our to-do app right here, a hard-coded to-do, right? CS9 and React to-do. So we'll keep with this example here because it's gonna help us all out. So notice we're extending component as well. That's the kicker here. So we have some state that's being taken care of, and also notice that we have just hard-coded state in this manner. Okay, but what happens when I start playing around with our to-do app? Do dishes, and then I refresh the page. What's going to happen to our state? It's going to reset. It's not persistent, right? So, and that's fine. We built a component that is reliant on this shop for food. It's hard-coded data that lives inside of our application. But the next time we come back, our component unmounts and then remounts again. Okay, so we go through, every time we refresh or change the page or something, we go through a component lifecycle. Okay, and part of that component lifecycle is this render method. Render gets called at different times throughout the component lifecycle. Okay, and what's cool about that is render also gets called, implicitly when we change the state. So the component lifecycle in React, there's a really cool chart for it. And this is all in your notes from Training Kit about the component lifecycle. This little image from Tyler McGinnis is wonderful. Now, there's some things to ignore here, and some things have changed since the time that this article was written. One of those is default props. We don't use that. We use that in a different way. Same thing with initial state. Because we have constructors, we don't need that. Okay? And now with the release of React 17, this is going away. And so is this, and there are new things that are new methods that are given to us in the component lifecycle. But notice some of the things that we do know already. We know that render lives here, right? So as our application gets mounted to the DOM, we're going to use our constructor to set up state. Okay, so this is going to build out our initial state for us, and we can hard code that, or we can figure out some other things. But what happens if our data is nowhere to be seen. What happens if our data lives somewhere else across the World Wide Web? Well, we have a lifecycle method that gets called shortly after we start mounting some stuff to the DOM. And that is called ComponentDidMount. And that's the lifecycle method that we're going to concern ourselves with today. It's going to go out and it's going to fetch some data, and then we can call setState from within ComponentDidMount. And then once that setState is called, render will get recalled again. And then we'll have the new data. So this is our little data. So let's actually annotate that as per Matthias's request. Okay, I'll do some annotation here real quick. And let's see what happens as we start building this in this fashion. Okay, so this is just a chart explaining to you sort of the life cycle of a component, right? And there is a video of me talking about this, but it's a little bit outdated compared to the material that you're working with today, the assignments and whatnot. So it may, it could be something you watch over a bowl of Cheerios at lunch or something. And you get a chance to kind of see me walking you through and explaining that our life cycle of our component is a component that gets built up and mounted to the DOM, and then what happens if there are updates, and then what happens when that DOM is relinquished of that component. So it's this idea of being born, updating and changing, and then being destroyed. So inside of our constructor would be, let me clear that drawing because it's annoying. So inside of our constructor would be where these things happen now. Okay, we have an initial state and some default props as well. Okay, let's see what I mean by that. Once again, I annoyed myself with my drawings. Okay. So inside of our constructor, we are setting up initial state, right? So constructor. This you can think of as a lifecycle method, but it's really just used now to replace lifecycle methods. Okay, so we're going to say sets up default state, or what they call it is initial state. And the hardest thing for me to do is get you really good articles and demonstrations on this, because these methods change constantly. Well, not constantly, but like they have gone through a lot of changes in the last couple versions of React. And so a lot of the articles and things are out there built in 2017 early on, and yet they're still pretty much out of date. I believe this one was put together in 2016, and it's already, you can see I crossed off a lot of the methods that are gone. Okay, so we set up our state in our constructor. That takes the place of this default props and initial state. Well, it takes the place of initial state, but default props you can do down here by calling app.defaultProps if you have any. Just like we did in the demonstration on that with the buttons on the first day of our React. And say that name equals Ryan. And the default props on this app component will be available to us. And then some of the newer patterns today are setting things like default props as statics. So default props equal your variety of default props that you want put together. But for now, just do it this way. Set up your default state. You'll be good to go. Okay. So React is really good. That's a very good question, Cruz. React is very, very good at making sure that you have ample time to go and upgrade their code. The reason they're very good at that is because they have an application with well over 50,000 components. So because of that, they have to take their time to upgrade as well. So the changes to these lifecycle methods, even though they were just announced this month, this like last couple weeks, they will go through 6 more versions of React to get to 17. So right now we're on version 16.3 or whatever. Once they get to 17, they will be deprecated, and React's team will have to have that those changes made as well. We will talk about component will unmount in terms of why it would be called and why it's cool. Thank you, Lucas. It's a very good question. Okay, so now let's actually use these methods to our benefit, right? So I can actually get rid of this data, and I need to now just see if our application works the way that it should. Cool, we still have our to-do application. It's working the way that it should. And we're actually going to pretend like this data lives somewhere else, okay? And the place that this is going to live, and we're gonna set the state initially when we're rendering our application, would be in a function called ComponentDidMount. Okay, ComponentDidMount. Let's just simply console.log. CDM called, and let's actually do a set state in here so you can see sort of the idea of this lifecycle. And if these lifecycle methods exist, then they can trigger changes in things, right? So I can now say name equals Ryan. Okay. Ooh, it does not like my new word, canosal. Okay, console.log. Let's see what happens as this component mounts. And I'm going to also console.log some stuff in the render function. Okay, this is going to demonstrate pretty well what happens on our initial load of our application. So initially, render function was called. Then we called ComponentDidMount, which then calls this.setState with some data. Then render was called again. What is render's purpose? What is the purpose of our render function? Yeah, it's simply there to draw or redraw, or what is it like in JavaScript terms, update on the screen, but in JavaScript, what is it doing? Sure, it's like a Unity update. I know nothing about Unity, but if you want to think about it that way, I'll be fine with that, as long as you draw the parallels that make sense to you. Updates the DOM. So I'm looking for some specific terms in terms of JavaScript. Return. Yes, Harrison, and you said it very explicitly. It returns, and Justin, you said it as well, it returns new nodes. It returns our React create element. It returns JSX, right? So render's primary function is to return some sort of DOM elements. So I was looking for the word return, okay? Because you can't have render without returning something, all right? So notice, because we're invoking render just by initial, and also notice that render was only going to get called once if we do nothing here. Render's only getting called once, okay? Let's see what happens as we navigate our application the way that we have it in terms of calling set state. Let's see what happens with render. Render was called again. Interesting. Why was render called? What just triggered? What function in my code just triggered to call render? There's a handler for it, but what function was just called? Yeah, we called an onChange event that's bound to the handler. Set state. So anytime set state is called, render will also be called. Oh, and we have that awesome warning. Could get rid of that in T minus a couple of seconds. But yes, render will be called over and over again, as we make changes to our state. That is why render is so powerful. Okay, that is also why set state and state are so powerful, because our application is state driven. Our data being displayed on and off the screen is driven by the state within our application. Okay, so if we want to tap into that life cycle and give some data to our screen that's not necessarily there to begin with, we can do it right here inside of ComponentDidMount. And this is the perfect place to go and fetch some sort of data. So I can do this whole logic of creating a to-do, this logic. Creating a to-do and adding it in to our to-dos, or I can make my to-dos a little bit more persistent, which is one of the stretch problems in your to-do app anyway. So we'll move this conversation into our stretch problem, and you're gonna love it. And we're gonna get through ComponentDidMount and ComponentWillUnmount as well. All right, this is gonna be so cool. So we're gonna actually take the to-dos that we're adding into our application, and we're gonna set them on. We're gonna set them into our browser's memory using local storage. So I'm going to use a lifecycle method called component. Let's see, component will unmount. Component will unmount, that one. Cool. Now, component will unmount is going to take whatever is on state, and it's going to shove that memory, shove that state into local storage. Okay, so we're gonna do this. So, and if you look at the local storage API, it's pretty straightforward. It's a getter, a setter, and a delete. So local storage, window.local storage. And okay, cool. Local storage.set item, my cat equals Tom. So let's just do this. We can do this right here in the browser. So I can say something like local storage, and then I have my set item as dog, and then the dog is just going to be a string. Everything needs to be a string, so there's some caveats there. The string needs to be Grizzly, because that's my dog's name. Cool. Let's see what just happened. If I look at the application tab inside of my Chrome's DevTools, and I look at local storage, I can see that I have a key value pair of dog and Grizzly. So if I want to go and say const my dog equals local storage.get item, and ask for dog by string, and then I want to just look at what's saved to my dog variable, it's Grizzly. So it's an object. It's a database for us, and we're going to take our to-dos, and we're going to add them to our local storage with component will unmount. Then we're going to go through the whole life cycle of our application. Okay, so from here, I'm going to say const to-dos, just like always, just give me a reference, to-dos equals this.state.to-dos. Or sorry, this.state, because I'm destructuring it. Then all I need to do is say local storage.set item, and then call this to-dos. And then who knows the gotcha with local storage? Can I just send this an array of to-dos? What would be the problem there? Nobody knows the gotcha? That's great. This is good. It wants a string, or it's going to coerce what you give it into a string. So if I'm going to give this an array, it's going to screw everything up. So let me show you that by default. So const let's do this. Local storage dot set item. If I just gave this an array, my R, doesn't need to be capitalized. It probably shouldn't by convention. And I said foo bar. Watch what happens to my array when I go and retrieve it. Foo bar. It's just a string. So we need to string life it. Stringify it. I read the stringify. Strangleify. Okay, so we need to say JSON.stringify to-dos. And then if we do that, local storage.remove item, and then I'll say my R. Okay, check the memory, see if that thing is gone. And if you notice it, well, it should be. I just clear it all. Didn't really remove it, I don't think. Oh well. And then now if I do that same thing where I set it, but I pass it through JSON stringify, it's hard to type in the browser's console. It's not always the easiest thing for me. So now if you look inside of application, we actually have a stringified array. So when I request it, what's it going to be? Nayli, that's totally fine. I will definitely do that in just 1 second. It's going to be a stringified array. Okay? So if I want that to be parsed back out into an array, I use json.parse. And there we go. It's an actual array. Okay, so what have we gone over thus far? What are we trying to accomplish here? I'm trying to demonstrate with a real life example based on your application that we just built together, the idea of component life cycles in React. So ComponentDidMount, what we're going to do, let me just give you a big picture of this. We're going to take our to-dos and we're going to set them in the application's local storage memory. So our to-dos are going to live here. Can get rid of that stuff. Okay, our to-dos are going to live right here in memory. On component will unmount, we're going to take those and we're going to set those to-dos. Okay? Takes to-dos from state, sets them in local memory as to-dos. Now, that same logic is going to apply with ComponentDidMount. And we're not quite there yet. I'm just trying to, actually, I might have, nope. Component will unmount. There are no objects in there. I should try and navigate away or something. Where are you? So yeah, what we're trying to do is tap into the components lifecycle. So these methods, are these methods that I created on my own? Or are these methods that React gave me? Where do these methods come from? Where does ComponentDidMount come from? So Harrison, in terms of creating a new class, you would be creating a new component, right? So you would just have to have your component live. And that's kind of what React Redux does for us, right? In terms of persistence here, it's best to just shove it in local memory, just for this intents and purposes of this application. Okay, so component will unmount. I'm wondering why this component is not getting unmounted when we navigate away from it. Let's see. Okay. Now I need to persist my logs here. Component will unmount is not getting called, and I don't know why. It should be getting called. Notice we're not getting this right here. Yeah, you'll see how it'll all come together, Harrison, a little bit later on. Why is this not getting called? Let me see. Let me go and restart my application. For some reason, I don't know why that would be the case, but component will unmount should be getting called as soon as, maybe it's never getting destroyed or lifted off the screen. We would have to, but this should work. I think if we're just navigating away, it's not ever changing. So this right now, the problem is this component will mount should be getting called. And if you look at the definition of component will unmount, the only method that, so right here, gets called before the component is removed from the DOM. So we're not doing anything to explicitly remove this from the DOM right now, which is our main problem. And that's a bummer because I wanted to demonstrate both the will unmount and the did mount, but the did mount is more important to understand. This would be more akin if you had like multiple components and you were transitioning from one component to another. So what we're going to actually do is we're going to take this logic, and anytime that our submit button gets called, we're going to call a persist to-dos function. And it's going to just take that logic and shove those things in the inside of the local storage. And it's just going to reset it over and over again. That might actually work. So anytime that this is called, before set state gets called, call persist to-dos, and there we go. So I had the proper logic, and we're good to go. But now, and that's not how you spell persist, but that's okay. Now, we have our to-dos available for us in a long-term storage. And this is the kicker of the demonstration for the morning. This is the idea of grabbing some data and setting it on state as our application is mounting, okay? So remember, in our lifecycle, let me not preserve logs anymore. Remember that in our lifecycle, I have some things going on here. ComponentDidMount is getting called, and render is also getting called, okay? ComponentDidMount gets called, then calls setState, and thus it causes a re-render. So just on initial page load, we should have a render, ComponentDidMount, and then a render again. So component would unmount would kick in if we had a component that does something and then is discarded after it is done. Component will unmount will get called when our component is getting unmounted from the screen. So, and to demonstrate that is a little bit more complicated than just refreshing the page, because you notice that our component was not actually getting unmounted. We were just navigating away. It was still, available at the URL. So that's why I tried to do like a navigation thing. So we'll get a better example of that. Yeah, I couldn't tell you, Christopher. It's just, it's maybe there's something that just happens in React land that's like, we don't care, they're navigating away. Like this has nothing to do with triggering a change. So, cool. All right. So now that we have sort of this functionality, we have some to-dos that are ready for us. Let's set those on state with ComponentDidMount. And this is where you'll, if you've been lost to this point, this is where you really should pay attention. And we're gonna do another example and play around with this, and you guys are gonna have a bunch of reps with this today. Okay? So sort of using this idea of ComponentDidMount to go out, retrieve some data. In this case, that data lives inside of the browser's memory, pull it out and set it on state so that it's available, and we trigger a state change so that we see it when the page loads. And it's just like, it's marvelous, okay? So we'll get called after initial render. CDM is a really good place to do initial data fetching. So this is where we want our initial data fetching to be. Const my to-dos equals local storage.getItem, and then we called them to-dos. How do I know I called them to-dos? I can see it right here. These are my to-dos. If I console that, boom. They're all stringified, so I need to parse them out. So I can do that right here on the fly. Okay, now that I have my to-dos, let's set our to-dos as, and I'm going to call these initial to-dos. And there they are. Now I can refresh the page and look, On page load, render was called, ComponentDidMount was called. It went and set the state of our initial to-dos, and then render was called again. Sorry about the Zoom being laggy. I can definitely work around that. Just work a little slower. Let me know if it gets unbearable. Hopefully the stuff is put together. Okay, so remember, constructor is setting up our initial state. So just an empty array and an empty to-do. ComponentDidMount is getting called after our initial render. We notice that here, render is getting called. Then ComponentDidMount is a really good place to go and fetch for data that doesn't exist in your application, which is the whole purpose of this afternoon's assignment and tomorrow afternoon's assignment as well. Okay, is to work with data that doesn't live just in state. You're going to have to use ComponentDidMount to fetch that data. So this is probably one of the most commonly used lifecycle methods besides render. So it's good to know those two moving forward. Okay? Perfect, yeah. So in our constructor, this is just plain vanilla JavaScript, but we're extending components so we get some added benefits because we're extending a base class. So we get our constructor, it sets up our initial state. We initialize our state object, and state is what? What's one way to think about state? Data with a combination of what does this attached mean, Christopher Marsh? Data and memory. Yep. Perfect. Data, toolbox of data, data in a lexical scope. You guys are wonderful. So data and memory, the data that we have in our application have available to us. So then we call a ComponentDidMount, because right now our to-dos is set. Well, okay, so here's what happens. Constructor gets called, we have our state, render gets called and renders that initial state. Okay, so it renders the initial state, which is just an empty array. It renders this stuff, just an empty array, and then setState gets called within ComponentDidMount. So React knows when ComponentDidMount exists, React knows to go and find it, and it knows when to call it. So it's thinking, the React engine is thinking, I see ComponentDidMount, I need to render, then I need to call ComponentDidMount. So then it will get called right after our initial render call. Right after initial render call. And then ComponentDidMount, it's a really, really good place for you to go and fetch for some data. So if you have some data that doesn't live inside of your application, like our to-dos that live inside of local storage, it's going to go and fetch those to-dos, and then it's going to call setState, which is going to set what's on local storage to our state. So then, right after setState is called, what gets called? And I want, well, anyone can answer, really. If local storage was empty, we would get whatchamacallit, an error. So it'll be a type error. Cannot read type to-dos of undefined. But to answer my question, persist. So I want you to think about where we're calling and invoking persisted to-dos or persist to-dos. So we're calling it in this handle submit to-do. From the looks in my code, where is handle submit to-do getting called? When I add the to-do, right? When I complete the form. So it's really just a helper function that has nothing to do with the component's lifecycle. It's just every single time we add a to-do, it's updating our local storage for us. So to piggyback off of Lucas's response, if this was undefined, we would not want to call setState, right? Or just make initial to-dos an empty array. So we would probably need to have a check in here before we do this. We just say if local storage.getItems is undefined, then set an empty array. That way it'll help us out. That works perfectly, what you just said. That's your logic. That's your condition. Okay, let's do some stuff together. Let's transition over to this, this cool little thing that I have built. We're going to pull in some data with ComponentDidMount. We're all going to navigate to this code sandbox. Cool. It was good to use that. I don't normally use the to-do example for this, but I really thought keeping us in the same application would help out a little bit. So if you have any feedback on that later on, let me know. If you kind of have an understanding of what ComponentDidMount is now from this, like it's good to stay in the same application. But now we are going to navigate completely away, and I'm going to have you take this URL. So Nayli asked, what happens after setState is called and set on local storage to the state? Oh, so what component lifecycle will get called after setState every single time? Starts with an R. Render. So that was the process, Nayli, is that you call setState inside of ComponentDidMount, and render gets recalled, gets called again. So anytime you call setState, render will be called. That's really just kind of the rule of thumb there. Ooh, I just zoomed in on my Slack and that was ugly. Let me zoom in here. Okay. All right, so here we have that same, pretty much that same exact application where we are returning a list of cities as props. So we have this thing called cities prop to a component called cities list, which is going to render a list of cities. Sweet. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to pseudocode this out. This has nothing to do with local storage, but we are using a data file called cities. If you open up your project's editor, you'll be able to see this data file called cities. It's just an array of data. Okay, array of cities. All right, let's walk through the rest of this. Cities list is going to take that data from cities.js, and then instead of displaying hello from cities list, I want you to be able to map over, so let me pseudocode this part, map over props.citiesProp, I think is what I called it. Terrible name for that. You guys can scorn me later. Cities prop. Dang, that's lame. Oh well. Map over cities prop. Return a DOM element for each city name in list. Okay? So that's what I want you to do there. So if I just refresh the page, or I just resave so you can refresh the page and get that change, and I'm going to save this as well. So this ComponentDidMount needs to fetch our cities data. Hint on that is that the cities data is already here, right? So if you console.log cities, great. Fetch our cities data, set cities on state for use in cities list. Okay, go ahead and refresh that code sandbox. Let me know if you got those changes. Give me a thumbs up in Slack if you refresh that code sandbox and you got those changes. Perfect. Awesome. Now, go ahead and finish that problem for the next 10 minutes. And we're going to spend 5 minutes right after walking through the solution. Okay, and if you want to reference, well, the local storage stuff won't work. Just follow these steps and you won't go on. Just remember, set state is a thing. So 10 minutes starting now. Okay, so a solution to the little exercise that I had you just kind of working through. It's okay if you didn't get it done, that's fine. You're going to be able to use this code in your next assignment for the afternoon. Okay, so let me just blow through this solution real quick and you can see kind of how it would be done. So the first thing that I mentioned was to fetch our cities data. So notice, let's console.log cities and let's see what we get out of the console. Notice that our cities, oh, we're console logging props in there, but our cities is this data. So it's cities.data would be what you want to set on cities, okay? So we're gonna set that data on state. So let me, this.setState, cities as cities.data. Now you may be confused by this, like why would this ever happen? Why would I nest an object or an array of things? Because this is how real world applications work. It's not every time that we get the exact thing that we want labeled as an array of beautifully butterflies, right? Most of the time we take data and we have something like a response.data.results or something, some archaic or like ambiguous thing. So now inside, and let me clear these consoles, refresh our app, and as we see it happening, props was called down here in cities list because what method in here in my app would have called the props console.log to be called on cities list? We're trying to mount cities list, so render initially gets called and we try and mount our cities list, and initially our cities prop is completely empty. Then ComponentDidMount gets called and it sets our properties, our array of cities on state. We call set state. So ComponentDidMount gets called, sets the state. Because of that, our render function calls again, and because of that, we see the props that are in cities list now contain some cities. So if I wanted to just render the city's name, notice that I have to call it city.city or something. So for each element in my array, loop over it. So props dot what? What am I mapping over? Well, what's on props? Props dot city props, right? Cities prop. So it's kind of a dumb name. So for each element, for each item, object, whatever you want to call it, you could call it city, but that's going to get in the way in just a second. But we'll just call it C. For each C, return me a div of C.city. What did I do wrong there? What's missing? Curly braces. Okay? All right. So you have this now. I just saved it. You have a solution. We're pulling in data from an external resource, meaning a file that's not inside of our component. This is considered an external resource, although some would laugh if they saw that I called it that. And you'll understand that why when we get to Node. Okay, we're pulling in data that doesn't live inside of our state. And we're setting that state on the component's state and rendering out our list of cities. Okay, and then you could take this, there's a lot more information in that data, you could take it even further. So now, here's what we're going to be doing this afternoon. You're going to be working on what's called the guided demo, which is just a sort of a smaller project than the one that you're going to be working on over the next couple days, okay? And after lunch, I want you to spend 2 hours maximum on this project, okay? You'll notice that the steps to initialize your app and your people list are very, very similar to this. We pull in cities list, right? We pull in cities from an external file. You know, here, external file, this would be app, okay? And then cities list will be a component that you build, but in this case, we're gonna call it people list, right? Now let's look at our data. The entire project between today and tomorrow is all about more sophisticated data that doesn't belong on state until it's not there until you call ComponentDidMount, okay? So this people's list data looks like this. Each person is an object with a first name, last name. It's got a unique ID, email, gender, occupation, and a list of friends. Okay? You are going to use this data to build out a friends list. That's what your project will be for the first 2 hours of the afternoon. And then after the first 2 hours is over, no matter where you're at in your React friends, because you can pick up this project later on, like Friday afternoon or something when you have some flex time and come back to it. So no matter where you're at, even if you don't get through the stretch problem, etc., even if you don't style it up, you can learn how to style your application with React Strap or styled components from the documentation. And I'll give you a little demo on that tomorrow as well. Okay, wherever you're at when you're working on this problem for 2 hours, I want you to stop and move to our bigger problem because I want you to spend a lot more time with that. And the bigger problem over the next couple days is a clone of Instagram. So talk about some sophisticated data, right? So these are the two projects, React Friends for the first 2 hours of the afternoon, hard stop after 2 hours, and then start on Instagram clone. And you'll notice the two are very similar in terms of your component architecture. Some of the only differences is you're going to have to build out this sort of header, and then you're going to have a list. So you're going to have to iterate over the data and display it like this for each element in your array of dummy data. Notice we give you the dummy data, okay? And really it's just 2 cards, so you could create whatever you want. But yeah, a lot of stuff going on here, thinking about it in terms of components. You have a header that has just some flat static components, and maybe this search bar is tied to some data. And then you have your card, and then you have your comment section, et cetera, et cetera. Those would all be considered components. Yep, you're going to be working on Instagram clone between today and tomorrow. And even if you don't finish React Friends, that's okay. Just get as far as you can playing around with React Friends, displaying the list of data the same way that you did it in this code sandbox. So those 3 URLs are coming your way right now. You can work on anything part-time. Oh, can you work on, oh, sorry, I didn't read that full comment. Let me read that again real quick. Yeah, you'll have a total of 6 hours in class to play around with Instagram clone, and you'll have 2 hours to work on React Friends total between the 2 days. But then on Fridays, you can work on any of your projects that you didn't get finished and polish them up. That's something that we highly encourage while you're waiting around for one-on-ones or check-ins in the afternoon. The class isn't done on Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific, class is still going until 5 p.m. Pacific on Friday. So you still have a lot of that flex time. You do have your sprint challenge in the morning and then a couple of meetings. So notice your calendar. So notice Friday calendar is the morning. You have your sprint challenge, then you have an instructor Q&A and a peer meeting, like a peer mentoring meeting, and then you have flex time, all designated for reviewing either your sprint or going over. So the sprint would be the accumulation of everything you did throughout the week, right? So Harrison, absolutely check in with your PM, talk to them about what you need from the schedule, Harrison. AFL, you mean away from life? Yeah, just keep on working, guys. I promise this will start to sink in. Get the exposure.